Mr. Speaker, COVID-era school shutdowns were the most consequential political failure of at least the 21st century. And we are finally starting to see some recognition of that. Yet, we still have not fully reckoned with the sheer breadth and scale of the harm that was done to so many people and to our entire country. We haven't had nearly the level of accountability for those who were responsible for these decisions. And we certainly haven't seen the fundamental change to public education in this country that what happened ought to have catalyzed. But at least we are starting to see some recognition of the harm that was done and the mistakes that were made. Here's an article from the New York Times. What the data says about pandemic school closures 4 years later. The more time students spent in remote instruction, the further they fell behind, and experts say extended closures did little to stop the spread of COVID. I'd like to read a few excerpts from this article. Some schools, it says, often in Republican-led states, reopened by fall 2020. Others, typically in large cities and states led by Democrats, would not fully reopen for another year. A variety of data about children's academic outcomes and about the spread of COVID-19 has accumulated in the time since. Today, there is broad acknowledgement among many public health and education experts that extended school closures did not significantly stop the spread of COVID, while the academic harms for children have been large and long-lasting. Dr. Sean O'Leary, a pediatric infectious disease specialist who worked with the American Academy of Pediatrics, says there's fairly good consensus that in general, as a society, we probably kept kids out of school longer than we should have. The article continues, a growing body of research shows that pandemic school closures came at a steep cost to children. At the state level, more time spent in remote or hybrid instruction in the 2021 school year was associated with larger drops in test scores, according to a New York Times analysis of school closure data and results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. At the school district level, that finding also holds, according to analysis of test scores from 3rd through 8th grade in thousands of U.S. districts, led by researchers at Stanford and Harvard. At districts where students spent most of the 2021 school year learning remotely, they fell more than half a grade behind in math on average, while in districts that spent most of the year in person, they lost just over a third of a grade. The article continues, the larger gaps that remain are among students that lost the most ground to begin with. Students in districts that were remote or hybrid the longest, at least 90% of the 2021 school year, still had almost double the ground to make up compared with students in districts that allowed students back for most of the year. As districts shifted towards in-person learning as the year went on, students that were offered a hybrid schedule did better on average than those in places where school was fully remote, but worse than in those in places that had school fully in person. In particular, young people in low-income communities suffered the most. The Times notes that the combination, poverty and remote learning, was particularly harmful. For each week spent remote, students in poor districts experienced steeper losses in math than peers in richer districts. The article continues, other things were also associated with worse student outcomes, including increased anxiety and depression among adults in children's lives and the overall restriction of social activity in a community, according to the Stanford and Harvard research. Finally, the article notes that closing schools did not appear to significantly slow COVID's spread. By the fall of 2020, when there were initial signs that children were less likely to become seriously ill and growing evidence from Europe and parts of the United States that opening schools with safety measures did not lead to significantly more transmission. That was clear in the fall of 2020, at the time that so many schools remained closed. Dr. Gene Noble, who directed the COVID response at the UCSF Emergency Department, University of San Francisco, said that infectious disease leaders have generally agreed that school closures were not an important strategy in stemming the spread of COVID. In addition to the Times acknowledgement here, you also have a new study out of Stanford's Hoover Institute that shows that because of the reduction in lifetime earning potential for students because of the learning loss they experienced, it is going to have a truly staggering economic impact on our country. The study finds that our nation will lose some $31 trillion, trillion with a T, 31 trillion during the 21st century because of this catastrophic policy. Now, while this Times article is collecting data 4 years later, this was all very clear at the time, from nearly the beginning of the pandemic. I said so myself when our governor, Gavin Newsom, in early July of 2020, ordered California schools to be closed for the coming school year. I released a statement saying today's decision elevates the appearance of safety over actual student safety. A growing body of evidence suggests school closures do little to flatten the epidemic curve while they are a calamity for kids. And I certainly was not alone in saying so. On June 29th of 2020, the American Academy of Pediatrics, quote, said that strongly all policy considerations for the coming school year should start with a goal of having students physically present in school. I did a survey of my district at the time. This is June, July of 2020, heading into the 2021 school year. 6,028 people responded, and over 80% said they wanted an in-person learning option to start the school year. And yet our governor, like many others, did not abide by their wishes. He shut down schools across the state. But tellingly, he sent his own children to in-person private school at the exact same time that he was expelling millions of less fortunate kids from California public schools. That tells you everything you need to know about the fact that he knew that his policy was the wrong thing to do. And while California was the very worst state in the country, dead last out of all 50 states in getting kids back to school, many states in this country reopened their schools far too slowly. Although many did, in fact, open for the fall of 2020, and their children experienced very little learning loss. And that is further evidence of what the data made very clear at that time. Now, the Biden administration, for its part, was complicit in all of this. The administration, for example, had all of the wrong priorities, going after the governors who refused to do child mask mandates rather than criticizing the governors who refused to open schools. The Education Department even sued, the Biden administration even sued states that opted not to do child mask mandates. Mandates, by the way, that flew in the face of all available evidence and ran directly against what the WHO recommended in some cases and our counterparts in Europe. The administration sued governors for refusing to enforce child mask mandates and yet would not criticize governors who refused to open schools. I asked the Secretary of Education about this myself at a hearing last year. I said, did you ever criticize Gavin Newsom or governors like him for refusing to open schools? Did you ever encourage them to open schools? And he could not give me a single example of when he did so. So the blame for this disastrous set of policy decisions lies first and foremost with the state leaders who made them. But the Biden administration was very much complicit in something that is going to be with our country, the harms of which are going to be with our country for a very long time. And so why is it important to still focus on this, now that we're through the pandemic and kids are back in school? In one infamous article in The Atlantic, the writer proposed that we have a pandemic amnesty, and we just forget everything that happened, and we avoid revisiting the mistakes that were made. But I think that is exactly the wrong thing to do, for a few reasons. The first is that it's an insult to the millions and millions of kids across this country who have suffered so much, who suffered dramatic learning loss, whose learning and lives and careers are now going to be held back, who suffered from a mental health perspective, from a social development perspective, who weren't able to play youth sports, who suffered so many other things because of what political leaders, people in power, knew to be the wrong decision. What's more is this harm is still ongoing. the harm that kids suffered, the learning loss that they suffered, they have not regained the ground that was lost. And frankly, we have not done nearly enough to try to provide the support that is needed to help students regain those losses more quickly. But finally, what happened during the COVID era provided a window into the broader failures in public education in many parts of this country. California, for example, even before COVID, ranked last out of the 48 states, second in the continental US, second to last out of all 50 states when it came to education outcomes in low-income communities. And then, lo and behold, California also had the worst COVID policies with the longest school shutdown. And so these both facts derive from the same underlying cause, which is that our public education system simply is not about the kids. We see that right now in the ongoing attacks on charter schools, where this administration has tried to cut grants for charter schools, where California has made it much more difficult to open and to replicate high-performing charter schools, and where just last week, the second largest school district in the country, the Los Angeles Unified School District, voted to restrict the operation of charter schools in what is largely a failing district. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we have a long way to go to fully come to terms with what happened in education during the COVID era in this country, and certainly a long way to go to make the necessary reforms to assure that every child in this country gets the education they deserve. But at least the acknowledgement we see here is a start.